Guess we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first edition of Bates Nursery Boot Camp. Today, we are going to do a lecture on pruning, and just want to do a disclaimer up front. We'd like everyone to try and mute their microphone, and we will be taking questions after the lecture in the chat box, so we'll be doing those through text. And just thank you for bearing with us during this first iteration, and we'll have a little survey at the end so y'all can help us get better at this.
Yes.
And again, I'm Ben Trest with Bates Nursery. Just a little bit about me. I have a bachelor's degree from the University of Tennessee in plant science. Graduated in 2011, and I've been with Bates Nursery for a little over a year and a half now. And we'll go ahead and get started on this first slide. So today we're going to be talking about summer pruning specifically, just to try to not make this really complicated and kind of focus in on the season we're in right now. And like I said, any specific questions, save till the end, as well as if it's more detail, in a little more detail, you're welcome to come in person and bring pictures. Okay, so first part is, why are we pruning? Is the first question we should ask. Just generally, we're going to be doing this for the health of the plant, and this is removing dead, diseased foliage, branches, crossing, crowding branches that could make plants crack or fall over, and also for shape. So this is where we get into topiary, shearing, and trying to keep these plants to a manageable size in our landscapes, which also brings up rejuvenation, which is a pruning I would typically recommend for fall or winter time for most plants, which is basically going to be a hard prune to reduce the full size of the plant. As well as lastly for blooms and fruit production. So deadheading, which is a big thing this time of year, helps increase further bloom production, extend the season, as well as certain times of the year. This is going to help with your fruit crop and make these branches extra stable to carry these large fruit loads.
It's not, the screen isn't changing on my phone. Maybe ask if people are able to see the screen. See, mine's still up right here.
Okay. Let me check this real quick.
There you go. Share. And then,
Hold on one second, y'all. Okay. And then timing for pruning. So right now we're going to be talking about summertime, but just in general, blooms and berries. We want to watch out for pruning just before fruit production or just before flower production, which can reduce the amount of fruit you're going to have in the season or eliminate it altogether. Pruning too close to frost date, fall or spring, can cause damaged buds and leaves and burning on a plant, stopping blooms and creating an unsightly plant, as well as to promote wildlife with the blooms and berries. So if we want to promote birds and wildlife feeding, we want to leave those seeds and the fruit on those plants. Evergreens, they're a little more leeway with evergreens. Most times of the year, we can do a light trimming on those or shearing. We also want to avoid large cuts, getting close to frost dates, as we said previously, because this can cause damage on that plant. And lastly, cut flowers. Deadheading is a great practice most any time of the year, especially if you don't need seeds or fruit in that plant. As well as this makes a great arrangement seasonally. Right now is a great time to go out, deadhead some of these plants, stick them in a vase, and extend that bloom into your house. So I want to do a couple rules of thumb today. First rule of thumb is pruning just after flowering is going to assure blooms for the next year. It's a good dummy-proof way to make sure that we are going to leave the plant enough time to form buds and flower for the next year. So if you're pruning just after those flowers are fading, you have a really good chance of doing it correctly. Okay, now into the meat of it. What to snip and what to skip. Summertime pruning we're going to focus on. Mainly we're looking at small trees, shrubs, and of course perennials. Any cuts that are going to need power equipment like a chainsaw, I'm really not going to talk about today. A lot of those should really get looked at by a professional because we get into some safety issues with that. And early summer, which we're kind of getting out of and in the past at this point, is really the best for doing some hard prunes or any cutbacks. So from here on out, really, I'm going to suggest a lot of deadheading in the landscape through the rest of the summer, like light trimming and cutting of flowers. So what to snip? We're going to talk about roses first because that's probably the most popular one this time of year to ask questions about. It's a great time to snip fading rose blooms if you can. Avoid stems with swelling buds because a lot of these grandiflora, floribunda flowers will put several blooms on the same stalk. But when those blooms have kind of all faded, it's a good time to cut those canes back with the rule of 5, basically trying to trim back until we hit a leaf of 5 to try to get more blooms onto that plant. And also just a note on cutting back roses hard, I would leave that until the late fall or winter. Next is hydrangeas. So hydrangeas, we really don't want to do any hard cutbacks right now again, but blooms can be removed if they're too heavy for the stems. This can happen in Annabelle hydrangeas as well as limelight hydrangeas. Any that are faded or starting to melt a little bit on the plant, those can come off pretty much right below the bloom. And again, save any hard cutbacks for the off-season fall and winter. And topiary and evergreens. So evergreens can take a light shear most times of the year. Boxwood, needled evergreens like juniper, arborvitae, things like that can take a little bit of a shear right now. But we want to keep those cuts under like a pencil or a pen size just to make sure we're not making big wounds on that plant. As well as holly, so we really want to touch on that one. Holly with its broad leaf, if we shear that too late in the summer, I probably wouldn't do it from right now up through fall. Can cause new growth and we can get an unsightly burn on that new growth on hollies. And one more what to snip. Perennials to me is the big one right now. So a lot of your perennials are getting through with their first flower cycle. And this should be the bulk of your summer pruning, is thinning those blooms, deadheading them, and allowing those plants to have a longer season. Just to note, secondary blooms after you prune, they do tend to be smaller on a lot of plants. So don't be worried. It tends to be diminishing return on blooms in the summer. And many of these cut flowers will last great in a vase. Here's some from my home. So we have some eryngium, some echinacea, Shasta daisy, and even dill. These will hold up really well in a vase for a long time. One more note on culinary herbs, perennials. Now's a good time to give them a snip to use for cooking or whatever. And this will really help bush them up to make a more attractive plant. And we're just going to note again the leaving blooms, especially on coneflower and rudbeckias, because those will go to seed and birds will pick those. So if you're feeding the birds, go ahead and leave those blooms on, and that'll give them food for the fall. And the last thing that I would suggest maybe considering snipping right now are ground covers in vines, like Vinca minor. We have euonymus vines. Those could be pruned with a mower or weed eater right now without too much damage. If we do it too close to frost again, we could get some brown tips on these plants. All right, our second rule of thumb. So keeping trimming under 30% at any one time and keep cuts smaller than your thumb is really going to reduce the stress on the plant and the possibility of disease getting into this plant, especially during a stressful time of year like right now in the summer. Okay, now we're going to touch on what to skip, things you should definitely avoid pruning right now. Hollies, laurels, magnolia, all of these broadleaf evergreens. If we prune them now, we're going to try to push new growth on that plant, and if that is tender new growth into frost, we can get some serious dieback on those plants. As well as if you prune hollies with berries right now, there's a good chance you will prune off those berries, big part of winter interest. Spring and winter blooming shrubs are another thing we should skip. And this picture is actually hamamelis, or witch hazel. That's one, viburnum, azalea, spring blooming, lilac, and loropetalum, which is going to bloom right on the edge of winter. We don't want to prune those right now because we may not have blooms on them the following year. And also heavy cutbacks really don't allow that plant time to put buds on. And lastly, deciduous trees. So redbud, we get a lot of questions about, flowering cherries, dogwoods, anything that is going to bloom in the spring. We really want to avoid hard cuts on right now because we may be cutting off our blooms for the spring. And a lot of this should be done in the spring right after flowering. As well as removing blooms, these big cuts can really stress a plant that wants to pull those sugars into the roots over the winter. If we cut that foliage off, it could lose a lot of energy to come out next year. So we kind of kept it simple, just kind of touched on some of these because we're going to open up to questions here in a minute. If there's some things more specific, more to tools and cut to cut, we're going to try to address that on Thursday, and we're going to do kind of a hands-on outdoor lecture. There we'll address tools, methods, a little more specific pruning techniques per plant. And again, that's this Thursday, August 13th. We're going to do a follow-up lecture with that. All right, guys, short and sweet. And this is, again, our first of the Bates Nursery Botanical Boot Camp series. So thanks for kind of learning with us. And now we are going to open it up to questions through text. I'm actually going to answer a couple of questions that we got through email before this lecture. And one's to do with roses, and this is specifically on drift roses. And really, you could apply this to any shrub rose or knockout rose. And Miss Ellen Borscher asks, do drift roses need to be pruned and deadheaded? You really don't have to. However, to get quicker blooms and a better shape to the plant, it's not a bad time to cut those deadheads on the roses. I've got one behind me that's more of a grandiflora. But basically what you're going to do is take those blooms off, down a couple sets of leaves if you can until you count a set of 5 leaves, and you're going to cut right above that 5-leaf node. That's going to allow for a much quicker response. Again, with the drift roses and the knockouts, you do not have to prune them, but if you want to, you can definitely get a quicker bloom out of them. Another one that we got before this today was from Arlene Curry, asking about hydrangeas, a real popular one this time of year. Asking if her hydrangeas bloom on old or new wood, and how do we prune if it is old wood? So yes, hydrangeas that bloom on old wood, typically those are our macrophylla, or the pink and blue, or the quercifolia, the ones that have an oak-like leaf. Those are the two that consistently bloom on old wood. We're really going to want to prune those just after flowering season. So probably late fall into winter would be a good time for those. The rest of the hydrangeas, the paniculatas, the limelights, and the Annabelle arborescens, you can really do those even after their first set of blooms, and you might be able to get a second flush. Those are a little less worrisome for early pruning. Next is one from Robert Grant, and he says he has new growth sprouting from the base of his rose tree. What should he do? So we usually call those suckers, and those happen on crepe myrtle, roses. A lot of times this means we're getting growth from below the graft. I would just trim those with a pair of pruners, as they come up, and that will keep the plant from putting energy into that growth that we don't want. And one more question we got before the series today was from Billy Butterworth, basically asking about neglected landscapes and starting a pruning cycle to start maintaining plants, keeping them down to size, and specifically saying crepe myrtle and rose of Sharon and other foundation plants. This is really typical for plants to kind of get overplanted in a tight space. I would leave a lot of this, what we call core pruning, to winter time or late fall. This will keep you from pruning any leaves off the plants and saving blooms for next year. We can get a little more into that in a later series. But a lot of this is called core pruning or rejuvenation pruning, where we're actually taking a lot of this old wood into the plant to allow it to flush back to where it is. I would say hard pruning in the fall, winter typically, and then followed up by a couple of shears or light cuts throughout the year. And we're going to go on to a few of your questions from live chat. Okay, so here's one. My boxwoods go brown and burn after a light trim. Any advice? So boxwoods can go brown. Now, a lot of times this is if they're in full sun. What you might do is wait for spring and fall cooler weather to prune your boxwood. But if you have to do it in the summer, make sure your tools are sharp for doing boxwood. With hand shears, this is much easier to sharpen those products. But if your blades are not sharp, it will, on a very microscopic level, damage those leaves, which is what you're seeing on the brown tips. So with the boxwoods, use a sharp tool.
Do what?
Try to keep your pruning under 30% and try to avoid within a month or so of what we think a frost is going to be. And this can keep you from getting that browning. Yeah, so here's another one on boxwood. When's the best time to trim a really large boxwood? I would say probably spring, fall. Spring after the final frost, and then late summer, early fall would be an all right time to trim a boxwood. With a really big boxwood, if we're talking about rejuvenation pruning, we're taking a lot off, we really want to save that probably for winter time. That way the plant's not going through a lot of stress. And I will address crepe myrtle. I've had a few people ask about crepe myrtles this past spring. We've had a lot of dieback on spring crepe myrtles due to delayed spring frost. We see a lot of crepe myrtles with brown tips on them right now. It's totally okay to go and prune those brown tips off or dead seed heads off of these crepe myrtles, as long as we're not cutting into live tissue. So if we scratch that branch and it is crispy and brown, you can go ahead and take all that dead growth off of these crepe myrtles. If you have a whole cane that is died back, you can prune that off as long as it's dead. If you can wait, I would wait until probably winter time to do that as well. Butterfly bush, same thing, a hard prune on a butterfly bush. I would wait till after the blooms and ideally after the leaves fall off. So we're probably talking early to late fall would be fine on butterfly bush. And with Budleia butterfly bush, you can really cut those hard. Just like a rose in the cool season, you can cut them to 6 inches from the ground if you want. One more on roses, specifically knockouts, being trimmed in the fall or early spring. With these reblooming roses, it really doesn't matter so much when you prune. However, in the fall is when I would do my hard cuts. So basically trying to pull that plant down to the ground to get it to be bushy the next year. I would do that late fall. And early spring is fine too. Honestly, I would wait until after we get our first frost. One more question about fig bushes. We might be talking about edible fig. I'm not 100% sure on that question, but let's assume we're talking about edible figs. I would do those just like blueberries. The next question. I would do those right after fruiting, So in the fall to winter is a good time to cut them back, especially if it's a newly established plant. I would wait until after it drops all its leaves in the fall, and then I would do a prune on it. And that'll give it time to put buds on in the spring, especially for blueberries. It'll give it time to put new blooms on in the spring, and hence the fruit on a fig. Figs actually don't need to flower to get fruit, so it's not as much of an issue. You could probably prune later, but ideally just after you harvest fruit and the leaves fall off. Let me scroll through here and see if there's any questions that I've missed. And I just want to mention, I did put a link to where a lot of this information can be sourced from in today's lecture, and it's from the UT Agriculture Department, so a great resource. And if you really need to get into depth on pruning techniques and where to cut, that PDF file at that link is really a great resource, and we will save this PDF file and that link for y'all to get access to. Picture on question about climbing rows. Climbing roses don't need to be cut back hard. However, I do recommend trying to thin those main canes to just a handful, maybe 1 to 4 canes. This will allow the blooms to be more vigorous on those canes. Again, you can cut them back, but I recommend leaving a few canes for the next year on that climbing rose. Looks like we might be having a few microphones that are echoing, so we'll try to get through that, but just try to mute your microphone if it isn't. And I will mention, I'm a landscape specialist here at Bates Nursery, and we have a few other experts, and we all have our own field that we really excel at. If you've got any special questions that we can't address today, or you need help with a landscape, or you just want to bring us some pictures and get our ideas, please come on down to Bates Nursery. That's what we do, and we would love to assist you in any way we can. Okay, so here's a couple questions about, I would really call them summer annuals or tropicals, a leggy shrimp plant and a lantana. So both of these are summertime plants. Neither of these really will live outside during the winter here. Now, however, you can bring them inside and get them to survive just fine as a tropical indoor plant, and then move them back outside in the spring, summer. The leggy shrimp plant, I would probably prune that sometime this summer and bring it inside, because if you bring it inside too late in the fall when it cools down, it may not survive that temperature change. I don't know as much specifics about the shrimp plant and bringing it inside, but we would just treat it as a tropical. And lantana, you can really deadhead that anytime through the year. If you're seeing spent blooms on lantana, just snip those off right below the bloom, and you should get more. That being said, lantana really won't survive typically past late November, December. So if you want to keep that lantana any longer, you'll have to bring it inside. Shoots from the bottom of a crepe myrtle, even if it has a lot of dead wood. So those shoots are suckers. Usually that's a sign that the plant is stressed, but it's very typical on crepe myrtle. I would recommend pruning those suckers whenever you see them. What that's going to do is emphasize that that plant needs to put growth into the mature foliage and not from the base of that plant. This happens a lot when we get spring dieback. If your crepe myrtle is dead all the way to the ground, I'm sorry. And basically those suckers are going to be your new trunks of the plant. So if you've had it die all the way down, go ahead and let those suckers come up, and you're basically going to be starting from scratch with a crepe myrtle. You can train those into a new tree. Well, I'm going to start wrapping it up. If anyone's got any last minute questions, go ahead and type it in, and we'll just try to wrap this up for y'all. Oh, blackberries. Sorry about that. Yeah, canes on blackberries getting pruned after producing. or in spring. I think both of those are great. Me personally, I'd probably do them right around now. So they, most blueberries are kind of, if it's something that refruits the second time in the year, you're probably getting through that second crop. With my raspberries, I am starting to harvest my second crop. Blackberries, raspberries, probably prune them here in the next couple months, or when the foliage drops off. You can do it in the spring, but then again, you're risking a little bit cutting off those blooms for an early season. So here's another bringing a plant in for the winter question about mandevilla. I really don't have much experience on handling mandevilla indoors, but as far as I know, it's pretty resilient. So I would say start pulling it inside, in the next, in about a month or two, as the weather starts cooling down. I would say once our temperatures get under 70 degrees, that plant should really be moved inside. It's really going to be about acclimating that plant. So moving it maybe onto a shady porch or a sunny room in your house before you stick it into its final location to try to acclimate it to that environment. But with mandevilla, you probably want to water it infrequently and deep. So we don't want that plant to be soaking wet all the time. And indoors is going to be even more important. So give it a deep soak every so often and let it get semi-dry before watering it again. And it should survive through the winter as long as you have a sunnier room. All right, y'all. I think we're going to wrap it up. Thank you all for joining us for our first webinar series. We really appreciate y'all being here, and we will see you on Thursday. Thank you.